All right, why don't we get started? About a minute early, but that's okay. All those latecomers will miss that 1 minute. First of all, before we start, I have to apologize. My printer broke, and so all my notes and stuff are on here, so I'll be reading off this. So please, my apologies for that. But my name is Neil Kleid. Welcome to the convention. Welcome to our panel, which is, if I remember the title, Jewish Adventure in Mythology and Fantasy Comics, or in Jewish, something like that. I've written a few books and comics. Some of you may have read them. Some of them are also labeled fantasy comics. And the word, I'm totally going to read this, sorry. The word fantasy and also the word mythology usually puts a lot of us in the mind of classic sword and sorcery books like Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Game of Thrones, and then hundreds of Dungeons and Dragons modules, if you guys have ever played Dungeons and Dragons. Or it could also put you in the mind of when people in like the mainstream use the word mythology, like Greek and Roman mythologies, so pantheon of gods, Medusa, minotaurs, dozens of legendary creatures and characters that you've probably read about in the Iliad, the Odyssey, or Percy Jackson. Elves and orcs, dragons and giants. When we talk about fantasy and mythology and adventure comics, those are kind of the basics, right? Those are like what a lot of people know. But there are mythologies and other stories that are not as well known to the common reader, or folks who enjoy fantasy movies and TV shows, like stories about Dybbuk and Shadim. Supernatural or biblical in nature, rarely popularized in film or comics, or even mentioned by the dedicated few. But those stories are out there. Some are even in the mainstream arena. Henry Jones, for instance, hired to recover the biblical Ark of the Covenant. You may know him as Indiana. And of course, the countless golems scattered across TV, film, and literature, some implicit, like in the Pulitzer Prize-winning Michael Chabon novel, or on an episode of The X-Files. And some references which are a bit more veiled. I mean, there are some who say that Superman's a golem. Or is he Moses? I guess it's all relative. The point being is that when it comes to Jewish adventure stories, or really Jewish comics as a whole, many authors are doing the noble work of trying to highlight and explore mythological and biblical stories stemming from Jewish texts and folklore. Seizing the opportunity to bring to light the more fantastical and supernatural aspects of our Jewish heritage, and then present them to audiences for whom they may not be instantly recognizable. Barry Deitch's Hereville, for instance, does a great job in doing so, as has the comic Breath of Bones by Steve Niles, Alan Moore's Promethea, and many, many more. Today, I'm excited to have a conversation about telling those kinds of stories, the joy of bringing them to light for an audience with whom they may be unfamiliar, and the obstacles involved with a group of talented authors to my right here, happily seizing the opportunity to do so. I'm going to start down at the end. Amit Tishler has over 15 years of experience at the intersection between TV, comics, video games, and technology. He's worked for Cartoon Network, Warner Brothers, HBO, Comedy Central, and Nickelodeon, and more recently has written and produced original graphic novels and comics with both Humanoids and Mad Cave, which titles such as the recently released The Last Wardens and Edenfrost, a comic book about two Jewish siblings who summon a golem to help fight their way through the fires of the Russian Civil War. Welcome, Amit. It is great to see you and your fantastic hair once again.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everybody.
Ben and Max Berkowitz are award-winning creative executives and multimedia producers who have worked with companies such as Twitter, Beam Suntory, JetBlue, Disney, Alzheimer's Association, Meta, and more. Ben was involved with the Netflix documentary Memory Games and CNN's Unseen Enemy. Max hails from broadcast journalism, having worked with Yes Network, NBC Boston, ESPN, and many more. Together, the Berkowitz Brothers have teamed up with Dark Horse Comics and actor Josh Gad to create The Writer, a 4-issue series about a comic book writer whose life spirals into a terrifying adventure, putting him face to face with an onslaught of Nazis, demons, and mythical creatures, drawn directly from Jewish folklore. They were also very late today, so you can be angry at them.
Whoa.
Hello, Ben and Max.
Hello.
Ouch.
Nice to meet you.
I was trying to pick out my outfit, you know.
It looks like my agent.
Yes, he's all of our agents, by the way.
Yeah.
And then there's me. I write a bunch of stuff. Not important. But what I'd love to do before we get into some of the questions is I've mentioned both Edenfrost and The Writer. Maybe you guys can tell the audience a little bit about those books, starting with you, Amit.
All right. So, Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Edenfrost tells the story of Alex and Yuli Lowe, who are two kids who are trying to survive through the Russian Civil War using the mystical power of a golem. It's a story that primarily talks about identity. The theme of identity, the idea of identity as a construct, where the focus is really about the idea that weaponizing one's identity is probably the most dangerous and malleable strategy to hurt others. And it's a very emotional book. It's very heightened. It's very modernized in a sense that it's very like influenced by the kinds of media that I'm influenced by, so very manga and anime influenced. And it's a wild ride, so check it out.
Nice. Thanks. Should I hand it to your agent?
Sure.
Like, okay.
You go first. All right.
You guys talk about.
I want the older brother to go first.
It's okay, Papa.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this was a very emotional experience for us. You know, we've been in love with comic books since, we were drawing in front of the TV at our Papa and Nana's house. So as our first comic book series, this was a wonderful experience, and we got to do it with a wonderful partner, Josh Gad, who you may know as the voice of Olaf and Frozen.
Book of Mormon.
He wishes he could be here today, and he apologizes. But our story, the writer, was basically about someone trying to survive in the comic book industry. Not really, but it's very much an exploration, an Indiana Jones type story, and a meta exploration of what it means to be a writer, and the pain and the joy that it kind of takes to write and put yourself out there in the world. And so on this journey, our character, a comic book writer, has the ability to write down any superpower, eat it, and temporarily gain that power. Which, it was funny, at Comic-Con, I would have assumed that most of the audience was Ashkenazi Jewish because all the questions were about bowel movements.
Literally every question.
Yeah. They're asking about, like, how does he deal with eating so much paper?
So we can get that out of the way
Yes,
now.
yes.
Okay.
And it takes a lot of tums.
And I love that we put a lot of our own lives,
Yeah.
experiences into this story.
Do you eat a lot of paper?
I was going to ask the same
He
thing.
does.
So, funny
Told him
anecdote.
not to do it.
When I was younger, we had like a mini Torah in our house, and I used to eat paper, and I ate the majority of that Torah. So whether
I
it
have
gave
questions,
me,
but not
Yeah.
for now.
whether it gave me superpowers or just indigestion and
Gave you
heartburn.
something.
Yeah.
I mean, and he's embodied the comic. I mean, look at this. He has two.
Oh yeah.
He's got the Ring of Solomon on.
Yeah.
He's got tattoos now.
Yeah.
Nice. All right. Well, that's commitment. Well, thanks. All right. So let's dive in. So we'll start off where I kind of left off. As comic book authors, and you guys can take this, whoever wants to run with this, what drew you to tell adventure stories laced with obscure Jewish folklore and mythology? Why not go the more traditional dragon and elves route? What?
Who wants to start?
When
You start.
You start.
Okay. Well, for me, I think specifically with Edenfrost, the timing ended up being very surreal. So a little bit of background about me. I'm originally from Israel, and both my grandparents are Holocaust survivors. So I grew up with stories and messaging about anti-Semitism, the danger of it, and so on and so forth. But when I was growing up, I grew up in primarily Jewish state. So for me, being Jewish seemed like an everyday thing because you're surrounded by essentially everybody is like you. And I never really had to think about anti-Semitism in the same way. It was always this thing that's you're aware that it exists. You know what it is, but your familiarity with it is very limited to the Middle Eastern experience, for what it's worth. When I moved to the States, which was around like 2010, one of the things that my mom told me, she said, like, I know that you're not religious. I know that you're not like very traditional in any sense of the word. But when you go out there, you will be identified as a Jew. So at least be a proud one at it. And to me, I was 20 something years old, a little bit cocky. And I was just like, nope, people are going to identify me for what I am, and that's it. I do have a very like strong, bold personality. And I think that, 50% of it was correct. That is true. Like when my friends here, I assimilated pretty easily. My friends here don't think about me as a Jew first and foremost. At the same time, I think one of the things that I realized very quickly, and that really resonated from what she was saying, it didn't really matter what I think about myself, because identity is a matter of perception, and it's a matter of how other people perceive you, not how you perceive yourself. That's when it really matters. And when I wrote Edenfrost, the trigger was, this was 2020, so things were getting pretty heated in the States, and I think this is the first time I've ever seen, Nazi flags being raised on US soil on television, and I went, okay, Mom's message kind of rings true. It all of a sudden makes you realize it doesn't really matter how I think about myself. If one day somebody wants to target me, they will target me because to them, I am a Jew regardless of what I think about myself. And that was at the core of every, let's say, design or story decision that I put into Edenfrost. And it also led to a lot of the choices that I made in how I built the world itself. Like the main I have two main characters, Alex and Yuli. Yuli is named after my mother, Yulia, and her personality and look and pretty much everything about her is based on my grandma. Like a lot of it really came down to like being very personal and wanting to make a statement about identity being a construct and how dangerous it is when you weaponize it. Now, all of this really came to a head and was surreal when the title was announced. I was in New York Comic Con in October of 2023. I was in Iceland in a trip when the October 7th attack happened. And I literally was a week later in New York Comic Con talking about identity weaponization, like exploring anti-Semitism. And it felt oddly relevant in so many ways. To add on top of that, I chose the location of Ukraine for the setting of Edenfrost, not because of the war in Ukraine, because I developed and pitched this to Mad Cave Studios before the invasion even started. So all of these things that ended up happening all at the same time just kind of head to the same moment where I just went like, this is oddly relevant, and I really didn't need it to be extra relevant this day, right? And so that's what drove a lot of this. And as far as the golem itself, to me, this was a symbol of both Jewish protection and a cautionary tale, right? Which very much fit the kind of story that I wanted to tell. And I like breaking down myths and not actually sticking to what they are. You guys did a very similar thing in The Writer, in a sense that you were like, we know what a golem is, but we're going to tell something very different. I did the same thing in a very, very different approach, because to me, that character and the mythology behind it is a tool, and it's a tool that I get to break down to tell the message that I want to tell. So if you read Edenfrost, you'll basically realize, oh, you are talking about a golem, but this is a very different way of interpreting it and what it means to the story itself. So again, all of these things kind of came together, and the story just ended up being more relevant than I wanted it to be, but that's the crux of it.
I mean, ours was pretty similar. I mean, there's multiple factors as to why we made a story about a Jewish superhero, but we created this 2 years ago, right? Before.
Yeah, I mean, we were experiencing, a lot of
anti-Semitism.
we were experiencing a lot of similar, anti-Semitism and like everything that was going on in the world at the time. But kind of what really drove us for this particular story was that, and it was really upsetting, was this trend where you'd see Jewish identifying comic book characters, and as they made the jump from the page to the screen, their Jewish identity was kind of getting sidelined.
There was one show that really pissed us off.
This was like the spark. It was Moon Knight, who in the comic books, his identity is tied to his Jewish identity. His father is a rabbi and a Holocaust survivor, but in the show, they sidelined it. You only get like a brief moment at like a Jewish funeral where he tosses his kippah on the ground, and that's it. They move on. So,
and they made his mother out to be crazy.
Right.
Like, come on.
I mean,
to be fair, no.
yeah.
I mean, her mom
To
is
be
crazy,
fair.
but I love her
Yeah.
and she's great.
Yeah.
All right.
You know this is being filmed,
Right. Yeah, she knows.
She knows.
But so we felt that we needed to tell a story where the identity of the story was built around Judaism and our character, and you couldn't take that away. So we wanted to reach out to a high-profile celebrity who is also very open
His
about
grandparents have they're Holocaust survivors.
right, and he is constantly fighting anti-Semitism on the public space. So we reached out to Josh. He kind of fell in love with this concept, and we really wanted to help that elevate this story so that one, we were focused on telling this as the best comic book it can be, but if it ever made the jump to the screen, that you couldn't take that identity away.
Well, let's get back to Josh later.
Yeah.
But I sort of wanted to follow up
Yeah.
this question with: were you worried at any time that when you were telling these stories that, because I've written some very, very Jewish stories, like graphic novels, and one of the things that's always kind of worried me and my family is, are you limiting your audience, right? Are you limiting your potential audience who may not be Jewish, they may not connect to the mythology, to the folklore, to the stories that you're trying to tell? And what have you found the reaction to be to both your books in terms of that?
I'll give a multi-layered answer because there's something in there that I think is worth addressing specifically with Edenfrost, given its theme and the way I chose to handle it. One of the choices that I made very early on is to make Alex and Yuli not religious, be secular. Like half my family was religious, half my family was secular as far as, when they lived in Europe, in Slovakia and Poland. And I specifically chose to make them live in a village that isn't Jewish, right? It's not a shtetl. They look and sound like everybody else, and that was intentional. Because when you look at them and when you listen to them, nothing really stands out that tells you that they're different. And yet it doesn't matter, because the story starts with a pogrom, which is driven through politics, right? It's a white army-driven pogrom.
How timely.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it started with that. That's why I was in such a weird headspace when I was in New York Comic Con last year. And it really was intentional to make the point that the idea of breaking down why anti-Semitism works, which is something that's been occupying my mind for a very long time. Because to me, the reason anti-Semitism as a weaponized tool is so efficient and so enduring is because of how malleable it is. It is so easy to adapt, because when you think about what does a Jewish person look like? I know that in American culture, there's a very specific image that comes to mind. I come from Israel. I'm the minority, right? I'm an Ashkenazi Jew, and I also look like this. But we have people from Ethiopia. We have people from, Tunisia, from Iraq. Everybody looks very different. So that doesn't really work. What about language? Well, not every Jew in the world speaks Hebrew. It is my first language, but again, we're not the majority. And people who came from Europe speak a whole plethora of languages. People who came from Arab countries speak a whole plethora of languages there. So that doesn't really tie everything together. And same with religion, right? Are you religious? Are you Sephardic? Are you Ashkenazi? The fact is, and this is the conclusion that I came to that I wanted to exemplify in this book in a very subtle way, is that it's an idea. And that's why I keep referring to it as a construct. The idea of the Jewish identity can be tailored onto whoever you want, in a sense. And that's the real danger of it, because there is a very Among Us concept behind it, right? If the white army is coming in and everybody's like, aha, we should target, or your Nazis come in and we should target Jews. I look like them. I sound like them. Well, if I point at them and turn them in, at least they won't go after me. That's the idea, and that's the paranoia. And the idea of it could be anyone, and the idea when you find that somebody is Jewish, aha, I knew it. That's where it comes from. And that's why I made that choice. So when the book came out, I was the book itself is not targeted at a Jewish audience. It is targeted at a general audience. I wrote an article for the Jewish Book Council, literally talking about why I did everything that I did in this book. And one of the goals, including making it like a very manga anime inspired type of structure and storytelling, was to try to essentially say, this is not a book for somebody on this part of the political spectrum or on this part of the political spectrum. It is not for Jewish people. It is not for Muslims. It is for anyone who likes these kinds of fantasy stories, right? And I think one of the things that I actually felt very good about is that after this book came out, it never actually came up. And I would consider that a point of pride because things were pretty heated in all social media platforms in the last few years. And this was never targeted. It was never brought up. And I would like to think that part of it is the fact that it is very agnostic about how it's presenting it. It's a story that is just human. And the expectation is that no matter who you are, no matter what you believe in, the cruelty or the methodology that's exemplified in this book is something that anybody can connect to. And it humanizes the very concept.
I want to hear from Ben and Max on this, but I did want to just, I wrote a book also last year called Nice Jewish Boys, and it's a crime story, and it's whatever. But the ending, well, not to spoil it, but like the one of the themes about the book, and it was actually inspired by, if anybody's read Bud Schulberg's What Makes Sammy Run, which is a great book you should pick up if you get a chance. But at the end of his book, basically, is talking about how this character, he embodies what was happening in America at a time. And it wasn't specific to that character, but it's specific to anyone who had ambition and drive and was willing to betray people. And so my story also, even though it's a very Jewish story, the idea is, it's this specific story, but it could happen anywhere, not even in Teaneck, New Jersey. Yeah. But Ben and Max, I do want to hear, like, why did you guys decide not to go elves, dragons, blah, 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 but go with, Jewish monsters and mythology?
I think part of it was we wanted to show, like you, how diverse Judaism is. I mean, Josh's character, Stan Siegel, in our comic, his wife is an Ethiopian Jew. We even researched and found this famous Bollywood actress that was Jewish. She was the highest paid actress at the time. What's her name?
She launched one of the biggest silent film movie studios in India, and she was Jewish, Mizrahi, I think.
And Josh himself is an Afghani Jew. That was a big part of why we picked him as well.
But, and we went into kind of this, not really worried that we were going to, isolate any audiences. We went in thinking, like, we're going to tell the best story possible. It's going to be entertaining. It's going to, connect with people on a human level. That was our goal. And also the fact that Jewish mythology has influenced pretty much everything and anything.
Yep. Like you said, Superman.
You look at Poltergeist 2.
Scared me. I was so
really,
scared.
Really deep cut. Poltergeist 2.
I know.
I can't look in the mirror anymore.
Yeah. Well, at Jewish funerals, you're supposed to cover all the mirrors because there's a potential to allow these demons that are going to take advantage of the trauma and sorrow. So in Poltergeist 2, these demons are coming through every reflective surface possible. So you see this in pop culture, but it's never referenced as Jewish. So we didn't have any fear that it was going to isolate any audiences if we were going to involve Lilith or Behemoth, the Leviathan, King Solomon. So yeah.
Nice, great. All right, let's talk about the golem in the room. So I remember reading as a kid. I don't know if anybody has read Mendy and the Golem, which was like a comic that came out from Chabad. It feels like everywhere you look now, a Jewish comic book has to include a golem of some kind. Marvel Comics has a golem, not just the ever-loving Ben Grimm, but a character named the Golem. And then DC has had both the Monolith and the Pages of Ragman. Golems are everywhere. And so I guess the question is, why do we love them so much? And is an oversaturation of golems in literature and media preventing other more obscure creatures and character from Jewish mythologies and folklore from breathing air and coming out?
I mean, and also don't forget, like, Frankenstein's monster was a golem, famous golem. So, no, I don't think there's an oversaturation. I mean, I think the idea of, like, creating this this protector that can also, get out of your control is like an interesting concept, with Frankenstein's monster. There's also a great comic book out, The Golem of Venice Beach, which is phenomenal. But no, I think, there's so much to tap into. I literally have a whole spreadsheet of all of the mythological creatures, all of the magical amulets. I didn't know growing up that Jews in antiquity practiced magic. If I had known that, I might have become a rabbi. Yeah.
Or a wizard.
Or a wizard.
Wizard.
Or a wizard. So no.
What does a wizard pay? Like, what do you get paid to be a wizard?
Good benefits.
Right?
Yeah.
Good benefits. There's good health care to be a wizard. Awesome.
Probably worse than a writer, so man. Like
Fair.
Fair.
that.
But yeah, I think I don't know where I was going with this, but no, I think there's just so much to tap into, and golems are fun, and we tried to put our own spin on the golem, with the idea of writing life and inserting it into the mouth of the golem. Instead of having life on the forehead, we put a kol, which means eat, which Josh also thought was funny because it made fun of his weight a little bit. But
We put our favorite Jewish deli in there.
Yeah, everything was inspired, and but
Well, every Jewish comic has to have some food reference, I think.
of course.
Yeah.
Exactly. Of course.
Yeah, I think the same thing that works with a golem is the same thing that works in anti-Semitism. It's malleable.
Right.
It's simple.
Mhm.
It's easy to understand. And it's also easy to break down and modify. Because as long as you have a few key elements in it, it's very easy to just call it a golem and it'll be true enough. And I think that's powerful. And I also think the idea of there's a lot of narratives that aren't technically golem narratives, but you can see the crux of it in there, like the Iron Giant, right? And that
Also a Superman story.
also a Superman story, exactly. So all of these things really, really tie together. I think because it's so malleable, because it's so flexible, because it's so relatable, it has an enduring power. I chose to take a very, very different approach to it because I wanted to essentially create a magic system that allows me to convey my message through it. So it was a deconstruction of the very idea. It stretches it, but once again, still fits because you have these elements. You have the trigger, you have the creature, I use it as more of spoiler alert, it's almost like an armor that builds around the person who summons it. But once again, you have the summoner, you have the signature, or you have the thing that triggers it or makes it come to life, and you have the big, bulky rock and ice and creature itself. So that's my take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I never always like to steer into these conversations, but do you think that Stan and Jack subconsciously did that with Ben Grimm? Like that he was their golem?
Subconsciously?
Or implicitly?
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, okay.
I think Stan had his own issues with his Judaism, so I think putting that out there was kind of his way.
Which
to
borough
express it.
was Ben Grimm from?
Brooklyn.
Brooklyn. Yeah. There you go. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Well, I guess this is sort of since we're already talking about characters and creatures, when you were researching your stories, your mythologies, what was the most eye-opening thing that you learned? Are there any biblical or mythological stories that you didn't have a chance to highlight but you think need a bigger stage? And I'd like to specifically hear from you guys because I know there's a lot of King Solomon,
Yes.
demons, and I'd love to hear just what did you learn that didn't make it to the page that you think people here would love that maybe they haven't heard about?
Well, one that made it to the page that I love is the Red Jews.
Oh.
Red
Yeah,
Jews.
yeah. And especially because he has a nice red beard.
Yeah. That was actually
So for those who are maybe unfamiliar, no, please.
Yeah.
So the Red Jews originally started as an anti-Semitic trope in medieval Germany to combat Judaism. They were kind of positioned as this barbaric tribe that was tearing down the walls of Christianity. But then later, Ashkenazi Jews took that story back and made it their own, made them this sort of powerful group of tribes that kind of live at the edge of the unknown world. So we sort of took that and brought that back into our story to kind of highlight that.
We had to make them look really strong, these Red Jews. Huge.
Right. Just to kind of also combat the image of Judaism in general. But I mean, there was so much that we researched and didn't make it in. Like we did include the Sword of Moses, but we sort of adjusted it a little bit as to kind of like fit our story a little bit. But
just a lot. I mean, even with like Lilith.
yeah, but like the Sword of Moses, I find is fascinating because it's a book of magic where you have to call upon these 4 angels in a specific order. You have to follow all of these like sort of steps, and it provides the user with this sort of mythological magical weapon. In our story, we kind of made this actual physical sword that provided like knowledge and was an unstoppable weapon.
Yeah, unstoppable against demons and Nazis. And our mother used it too, so it's great.
I thought you were going to finish to say, and our mother.
And our mother.
We really hate
Another mythological creature that we could not highlight.
Right.
Anything that I mean, I know your book was very specific.
My book was very specific to the golem, and like a lot of the information I was familiar with. I think that the things that came out of the research that I did for this book specifically, oddly enough, and this doesn't tie to mythology, but it ended up affecting how I broke down my version of the golem, was actually a lot of the historical facts. Because when I started researching and why I chose, everybody chooses like World War II as their setting. To me, part of the choice of not doing it in a World War II setting came from it's a little too familiar and it's a little too clean. Whereas when I started writing this and developing it, and I looked at the current landscape, people throw the Hitler reference way too often, right? And to me, where the world was and still isn't pre-World War II. It is actually a lot closer to pre-World War I in terms of the rhetoric, in terms of the division, in terms of like the chaos that came to it. And I think a lot of what I found during my historical research, which I ended up contacting Evo, and I got a lot of information just like to draw from and put here, is how much relevance it has to today's world, which obviously, as we're seeing from both the war in Ukraine and the wave of anti-Semitism now, and even how it's being conveyed, there's a lot in that time period that's being overshadowed by what happened in World War II, and it's definitely worth looking at because there's a lot to learn. But it also explains why narratives like the Golem have such an enduring power, because the idea of nobody's here to protect us, not even our own state, but what if we had a guardian, right? What if we had a guardian that's just for our community because we feel vulnerable? Like, there's a reason why that is such an enduring idea. And when I read it, like, it's a lot of very grisly information, especially from a lot of the pogroms that happened during the Russian Civil War. You really get this feeling of desperation and the need to believe that there could be something like that. Which to me really emphasized, like, yeah, this is part of why this is such an important narrative and an important monster or character in the Jewish mythology.
Nice. I mean, I'm going to weigh in on this one too. I tend to gravitate a lot to like more biblical myths, right? So like even King Solomon, right? This year during Yom Kippur, I kind of zoned out and I just read a bunch of books. Well, davening was going, and they talk a lot about things that you're like, they break the laws of physics. Like some of the mythology is, what was it? I think it was King Solomon. If I'm wrong, somebody correct me. But who sidestepped like raindrops to go fight a demon, right? Like I thought that was really kind of an interesting tale. And then obviously there's, which you guys have referenced to, like the myths of like there's Leviathan, Behemoth, the idea that there are these creatures that were set aside at the beginning of creation for the end of creation, to be a meal, to be hunted, and to be given to the righteous. I find those myths really kind of fascinating just because they're so outside the realm of my current mortal understanding that like you have to kind of like break your brain a little bit on it. But that stuff is always intriguing to me. And in fact, the only really mythology folktale work that I've done is in Nice Jewish Boys. There is like a small little like, it's a medrash. It's like something I heard like a rabbi say about a chassid who dies, and his son is like, please come to me after you die at night and tell me, talk to me, and he never shows up. And so he goes to his rabbi and says, can you, like, he never showed up. And so he's like, the rabbi's like, I'll go to heaven as was the custom of the time, to find out where he is. And the story. This is a Rabbi Shlomo Krobach tale, by the way, and he goes to heaven and he searches for him through all the edges of heaven and finds him by a vast ocean. And this is in the comic Nice Jewish Boys. There's a vast ocean, and he says basically, like, where are you? Your son's been waiting for you. Why are you standing here? And he says, this ocean is the ocean of tears. It's made up of the tears of all Jews who are in pain. And I vowed to Hashem, to God, not to leave here until God dries up the ocean of tears. And the idea is that when, in the comic was, if you're upset and you're praying to God and you feel like he's not answering, don't get disheartened. He's got an ocean of tears to get through first. And so that was like a folk tale that I really enjoyed. But I like the range between like creatures and, protectors and just stories that have like meaning. Like for me, I think that's what really opens up Jewish mythology and Jewish fantasy and adventure stories, because you can kind of tap that, which you don't necessarily always see in like Game of Thrones or, what have you.
And I just quickly, and I what we really love is that how multidimensional, Jewish mythology is. And you look at the tale of Lilith and how she was kind of expelled by Adam. It's a very like misogynistic story that because she wouldn't follow Adam, she was kicked out and turned into a demon. So we kind of infuse that into her character in our story. And then like with King Solomon, how he used his ring to manipulate Ashmedai into building his temple. It's like taking advantage of this creature, and how like demons aren't necessarily purely evil. And it's just like sometimes in Judaism, they're demons are just not God in Jewish mythology, which I found fascinating.
All right, so this one is for the two of you. Sorry, I mean, you kind of mentioned it originally. You've co-authored The Writer with Josh Gad and Ariel Olivetti, who's fantastic. And you were recently spotlighted in Forbes, so
Thank you.
Nicely done. Were they both as familiar with the folklore and mythologies upon which you grounded the tale? And what did they bring in terms of helping to highlight the Judaic themes you presented in the comic? And I mean, you kind of mentioned how Josh got on board, but like, how did you get him on board? What did Josh bring? What did Ariel suggest, like, as your co-author?
Yeah. I mean, first, Ben and I talk on the phone about like 20 hours a day. I think his wife hates me.
Yeah. My wife says like constantly, "You talk to him more than me." I'm like, yeah, pretty much.
So we came up with this idea on the phone with each other, and we thought of the perfect person, Josh, and we reached out to him personally, his manager.
Yeah, and we kind of pitched him this concept, how we want to tap into this mythology, the story, and he
knew everything.
He knew everything. I mean, he was dialed in, which was fascinating. I mean, we had like our first Zoom, and he was going through every single story, folktale. It was awesome. And then with Ariel,
well, first tell how you brought him on.
Who?
Ariel? Yeah.
Like everything today, I DM'd him on Instagram.
You slid into his DMs.
Yeah. I slid into his DM. But Ariel, he's kind of a legend in comic books, in Marvel. His Cable, like just his artwork is on sort of like a biblical level. Yeah. So I was like, we have to get him on board.
And it's funny, we thought we'd have a lot of trouble with him because he uses a translator.
No. It was really amazing, and he kind of fell in love with the concept. He was incredibly passionate about also using this story as a vehicle to combat anti-Semitism. He's not Jewish. He's Argentinian. But he felt very passionate, and this was kind of like also his way to kind of learn more about Jewish culture, Jewish mythology, and
even when we get an anti-Semitic comment on Instagram or something, he fights them.
He's the first one to comment. So he was brilliant, and like the way he would approach our story, we went in, we wrote this sort of this unknown world, this mythological place. And we went in thinking like, oh, it's going to be dark and terrifying looking. But he brought in like these like beautiful pastel colors that you'd see on like the Sistine Chapel. And like really kind of like flipped our brain in how we were approaching the story. And we actually use the ocean of sorrows in the story.
Oh, really? That's great.
Which is, I mean, because it's like it's such an incredible story. It also hit home.
Nice. Okay, cool. Before we get to Q&A, which I do want to get to in a minute or so, really quickly, are there any fantasy or adventure comics or graphic novels, Judaically themed or otherwise, that you're reading or you've read that you might recommend to the audience? Let's start with Amit.
It's not Judaic related I guess you can always tie something to existing themes, but it is just a fantastic series and a fantastic writer. I don't know anybody who's a comic fan who's not familiar with like James Tynan's work, but Something is Killing the Children is incredible. It actually, like that, a lot of the tone of the way he did the storytelling in Something is Killing the Children and in Department of Truth really inspired like Last Wardens, which is my currently running series, which is also like supernatural horror. His work is fantastic, and in every sense of the word, like it's also fantastical. And he does deal with interesting, not mythological, originally made monsters that are worth exploring. If you like fantasy, if you like horror, if you like atmosphere, very cinematic settings, fantastic. Also a nice house by the lake. It's more sci-fi.
And
So
now,
I love
and
it.
now A Nice House by the Sea.
I know,
that's
I
the
heard.
sequel. Yep.
Super good. And this is on a very different side of the spectrum in terms of, once again, fantasy. The manga Full Metal Alchemist inspired so much of what I do. I love it. And a lot of how they handle magic systems is incredible. There is definitely Jewish references there, to the point where they write some stuff, like they actually use Hebrew letters. They actually have like in the Gate of Truth, like the word Adonai on it. Like it's very explicit, so that's definitely worth checking out in general if you like fantasy, if you like those kinds of narratives. And very far from it, if you like dark fantasy, as dark as it gets, I'm currently reading, I'm catching up after like, this is a series that's been going on for years and it's much older, but Berserk is incredible. So those are my general recommendations. There you go.
That's pretty good. Well, like as I mentioned earlier, like the Golem of Venice Beach is, I've been loving it. It kind of ties into this whole idea of, generational trauma and how this, 100 years ago, this rabbi created this golem to protect his family. And then years later in Venice Beach, the descendant is this sort of like drug addict screw up who this golem now has to protect. So it's a very like interesting, nuanced story, and just like the team of artists that were brought on, like Bill Sienkiewicz, it's incredible. And then one of the books that's not necessarily Jewish, but because Jack Kirby was just such a huge, massive influence on all of us, is Alex Ross's Fantastic Four. He nailed Jack Kirby. Just the style, he brought that aesthetic with his art, and it's just like a beautiful, gorgeous, and I'm just obsessed with the thing.
Yeah, and Ben stole mine with Jack Kirby.
Nice. Yeah. Good job. I'll weigh in also. I'll give two. One that a lot of people probably read, because I know everybody's read Sandman. A lot of people have read Sandman, but if you haven't read Lucifer, which is the sort of the follow-up side book to that by, I think it's Mike Carey, it's also fantastic and also contains a lot of themes. Like Lilith is one of the main characters in there, so there's a lot of demons, there's a lot of references to Jewish mythology. So I highly recommend Lucifer, all the volumes, really a great story. But also a book called 1 Billion Genies by Charles Soule and Ryan Brown, which basically the concept is everybody gets a genie. Everyone in the world gets a genie, and you get one wish, and what do you do with the wish? And it's really about like wasting your wish and figuring out the right wish. It's really like a fun, funny, somewhat dark book. And then they also just came out with the first issue of their follow-up to it called Lucky Devils, which is kind of like the opposite end of that. Like everybody gets a devil. And so
Isn't that just us in general?
Yeah. Well, from what I've read, it's about two people who are so good that they're never using their devils, and so their devils reveal themselves. Sorry, spoiler. Reveal themselves and basically say like, we need to work together. And so it's really kind of Charles is great. A lot. If you ever read any of his Marvel work or his Star Wars work, he kind of rides the line between fun adventure and just like introspective. So I highly recommend all of his work. But we're about 15 minutes before we close, so I kind of wanted to open it up. Does anybody have any questions? There you go.
Is that vodka?
Yeah.
I thought it was very, very
Water.
good.
Water.
Thank you.
Excellent. My question is, what role are safari and like curating jewelry, like Chabad and Stockport playing in these type of comic fests? Or not traditionally, like I don't see anyone here wearing payas or any Moroccans, or what is their role in this, if any?
Well-
Or do they aspire to these roles?
Feel free to answer.
Hard for me to be able to answer that.
I know there are creators, and many of them are downstairs. Like Arnold Shore is selling a lot of books and mythological books set with like Sephardi main characters. I unfortunately, I usually tell a lot of stories from my own point of view. I'm definitely like Ashkenazi. I lived in America all my life, so like I tend to kind of tell those types of stories. There are a lot of creators out there who are telling those types of stories and telling, putting characters front and center. I just unfortunately am not one of them.
And they need a platform.
They definitely need a platform. That we
They
need.
have a platform.
I would hope that that people will be offering them a platform or that they can. Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there is one or not.
Any
I can't
publishers
speak-
watching
I can't
this?
speak to them, but there are publishers out there and editors out there. We need more stories that are not just Ashkenazi European Jews.
Well, that was important. Like in our story, we included characters that were Beta Israel, the Ethiopian story, and it just like happened to really work out seamlessly with the Solomon mission that took place. It kind of tied into our story and King Solomon, Queen of Sheba, and that sort of mythology. So, we really wanted to kind of represent that point of view, and so. When I was in Israel, I did a lot of research, working with people who were part of the Beta Israel community. But I think there needs to be way more.
Yeah.
Agreed. Anyone else?
Where do you guys find collections of the stories to use for inspiration?
When you say collection, you mean like the mythologies,
Yeah,
or
the
okay,
mythologies,
okay.
You guys want to start?
We just essentially for us, we were scouring the internet. We sat down. We actually worked with, a local rabbi. I'm from San Francisco, so from my temple, and then a lot of people. I went on this amazing trip sponsored by Schusterman in Israel called Reality, which no longer is going on, but. We were there with a bunch of leadership groups, and we got to talk to a lot of experts in the field, which was wonderful. But yeah, I mean, for us, it's been like a lot of books, research online.
I mean, we were really nervous about that. There's so many stories to tell,
So many.
and especially when you have 22 pages per issue.
But it's
can't-
amazing that like not that
Yeah.
many people know about this.
That's
Yeah.
what sequels are for.
Exactly.
Yeah, and for me, like honestly, because I only use the golem as far as mythology goes, like it was pretty simple. It's not hard to find information about that. A lot of the research I had to focus on really came down to trying to find out more about the setting, more about the war itself and how to use the elements there. And that was all over the place. I listened to a lot of talks by Alyssa Bompart, who I ended up talking to because I just listened to hours of. She's one of the few academics right now who's still heavily invested in researching and publishing work about Jewish people and the Russian Civil War in general and all of the programs. So I ended up listening to just like hours of her talks. Yivo provided me some information. I bought a few books just for the research that I gave Bruno Frenda, the artist that worked with me in Edenfrost, like because it was very important for me to be like historically authentic as well. There are a lot of different elements there that kind of hint at some of the world building that I established. And I want this to also be like an ongoing series. This came out this year, so we'll see where things go. But I've planted a lot of little things that you'll see in the book that are tied to Jewish mythology, but that I put a twist on. And I don't want to spoil why I did that, but you'll see different elements that are commonly found or you can find online. Like you'll be able to tie it to things that are very easy to find. The internet is a good resource. I think the challenge was less Jewish mythology for me because the golem is a very well-known figure. It was the historical time period, which is not getting the same level of coverage. That required a lot more work.
I will say for myself, just if I can sort of answer that, is as a writer, whether it's mythology or anything, like I'm a magpie, right? If I'm sitting in a room or if I'm half dozing and listening to television or whatever, reading something, like I'll seize on something and I'll write it down.
Yeah.
So like the Ocean of Tears story that I mentioned before, I was at a bar mitzvah and and I was half asleep and some rabbi kind of was really going off on it, and I was like, oh, that's fascinating. I should use that in a book one day. And after Shabbos, I wrote it down. And so like that's really, as writers, like I listen a lot, like I observe a lot, and so keeping like a notebook or even just like notes on your phone or what have you, or even hearing about a book like some of the books that Amit mentioned. Probably I have a big mythology book also that I got off Amazon, and like just being able to kind of keep track of that stuff and always be looking for more opportunities is really a good thing to do as a creator.
And I have a question for you. Is there a story you would like to be told that has not been told yet?
Oh, give me any story that you want people to hear. Like, I love obscure stories. That's why I'm curious. Like, where are you getting them from?
I just saw online, and I'm not going to go into the sources, but apparently there's like the mythology of a toilet demon, like a Jewish toilet demon.
Yep.
And like I kind of want to do
Definitely have
a little bit more digging about that
Oh,
one.
yeah.
Who like haunts like the toilets.
Every year after Thanksgiving.
It's Talmudic, yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. There was also like just like you were saying, like it's kind of like you stumble upon things. Like we stumbled upon, I think it was a Washington Post article about how these young children were experiencing these imaginary friends that weren't so imaginary, especially one girl who, for a year she was talking about this friend, and her parents kind of like wrote it off, and then they kind of asked her about the friend, and they were like, oh, she's really sad because she misses her family. She was taken away from her family, and she has numbers on her arm. And like there's no way this 4-year-old would have known about the Holocaust. So that kind of inspired one of our characters in our book.
And your son, Teddy, would
son.
wake up in the middle of the night and talk to somebody.
Yeah.
We would
Yeah.
see it on the cam.
Yeah.
And
He just like sits up having a conversation. I'm like, who
and
am
I swear, Ben and I one night saw it when I was staying at his house.
My son does that too, but I think it's
Spirit.
just anxiety.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Go back.
Yeah, I know a lot of times writers have to leave some of their favorite pieces on the cutting room floor. Are there things from either current projects or past that you had to throw away? And are there any ones that you can't get rid of that you just keep trying to bring back into your content?
Who should start?
Do you kill your darlings, gentlemen?
We murder them, unfortunately.
Yeah. I mean, for me, always, like when you work with a publisher, you also get like a page limit, whether it's the issue or the arc as a whole, and not everything should make it in. So definitely yes, but I also think that I'm a big fan of like working within constraints. So I think that limitation kind of forces you to really look at like the guts of your story and what's the most important thing that you have to put in there. There were a lot of things that I wanted to put into this book that I was just like, it's gonna have to wait. And some of the solutions that came from me going like, yeah, but this is important information. Like, well, it still has to be self-contained and standalone, but these seeds will be interesting. Like they could spark curiosity. And this is true to every series, whether it's like Edenfrost or The Last Wardens or the books that I'm doing with humanoids. It's just part of the editorial process, and sometimes you're forced to do that editing yourself. For me, it was a lot of I don't want to spoil anything if you plan on reading Edenfrost. I ended up making a strategic choice on how to show the golem/golems in it, where originally I wanted to put more spotlight on one iteration and ending up focusing more on another. That's all I can say, and I know it's vague as hell, but that choice made the book a lot better. Me being forced to say I can only kind of pick one as a primary and the other as a storytelling tool to convey an idea if you read the book, you'll see what I mean. But that's my take.
Yeah, I mean, there was so much we had to cut. I mean, one thing that I was really bummed we had to cut was Josh's character transforming into this giant, fleshy, hairy kaiju-like creature. And so, you know, the publisher didn't really want a naked giant
Joshzilla.
Yeah, Joshzilla essentially flying with
beautiful.
But
Oh,
the
actually,
audience
wait a
wants
minute.
it.
I'm sorry. Gadzilla.
Godzilla.
There you go.
I know, right?
Oh.
Writers.
It was right there.
Right,
Come
it was
on.
right there. We had to cut it,
Hmm.
but you know, it worked out so
Cool.
much better. you know.
Nice. I could take one more question.
Godzilla.
It's always struck me that the difference between a Golem story and a Frankenstein story is the moral preoccupation. Because in a Frankenstein story, the creation is like using the force of nature, but in a Golem story, the power comes from God. And I just wondered, any thoughts you had about telling a Jewish fantasy story and like where does Jewish morality fit into it?
That's good.
Want me to start?
Yeah.
Okay. Without spoiling, again, too much, I will say my approach to even a golem within the context of Judaism is very, very different. And I guess I can talk about it a little bit. It's not explicit in this book, but part of what I built into the mythology of Edenfrost specifically in this iteration is that in this iteration, the golem is not tied to religion in any way. It is not tied to Judaism in any way. It's actually an agnostic creature that just so happened to tie itself to a Jewish bloodline. It is something that was found, and now it is tied to the bloodline of this family, of these kids. And what drives it, now that I tell you that if you read the book, you'll see it in it, but I was trying to not be too explicit in the book itself. But the golem in this book is a spiritual creature. It's kind of an alien entity of some sort. And when it ties itself to a bloodline, that gets exemplified in pretty much everything when it connects to the person that it's tied to. And the golem's shape itself, when it's formed, is also tied to the person's kind of like spiritual being and personality. And it appears differently for every person that's tied to this bloodline that can trigger it. One of the reasons for that was so that I can have the golem have its own personality and drive, because throughout Edenfrost, it keeps trying to push the kids to protect themselves, to trigger its power, like you have to do this now. Alex and Yuli are very, very different characters in how they handle things. Alex constantly tries to avoid using it because he is a very diplomatic kid and he tries to resolve everything. He tries to be humane about everything, and he doesn't like something that's pushing him to violence. Yuli is traumatized and she ends up going for it and going big and losing control. But to me, that element was really tied to the whole magic system that I built around it, which once again was formed around the idea that even the monster itself, even this spiritual being, is agnostic, right? Like, this is just a coincidence, but now it's stuck. And if these kids die, it dies with them. It is tied to their bloodline. For all intents and purposes, it is now a Jewish creature. And it needs to defend itself as a Jewish creature. So that's the philosophy behind it.
And I guess sort of like the kind of Jewish philosophy that was like built in from like the trajectory from issue 1 to 4 was like this idea to always question, to always have like a sense of like good conflict, that you should never be satisfied with one answer. And so there's that sort of internal conflict that each of our characters are having.
And especially as a writer, the internal conflict throughout.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, guys. So before we end, let's go from Amit this way. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you want to promote, and where can people find out more about you and your work on the web?
All right. So, Last Wardens is my currently running series. Issue 4 just came out in stores. Can't make all the announcements right now, but we already announced a tabletop RPG and an audio drama that's coming out for it. The audio drama is going to have some high-profile casting, so stay tuned for that. And Humanoids just soft announced our first book. Me and Elliot Sproul, who wrote The Last Wardens with me, our first book with them, Postmortal, which is coming out next year. I have more books with humanoids and paper cuts coming out in the next few years. So if you want to follow my work, it's amittishler.com, and I have a newsletter called Mind Splatter that kind of like outlines a lot of my work. Sometimes I tease things that are coming down the line. I'm active on all social media platforms, even though they're a shit show, but
Yes, they are.
I do not engage with any politics on them. It's all just focused on my work. So if you want something that isn't toxic and poisonous and just shows a lot of very cool marketing artwork, because me and Elliot are both animators originally, so follow me. That's pretty much it.
We have another comic we're announcing. We can't really say that yet, but the paperback we can.
Oh yeah, the trade
Yeah.
paperback is coming out in April, which we're very excited because there's also a special direct market edition that we're very excited about.
And that's announcements Monday.
yes,
right?
that announcement's
Tomorrow.
coming out tomorrow. And yeah, we are continuing the story of the writer. We also have been in development on a TV series with Mike Mignola, the creator
Oh, yeah.
of Hellboy.
Hell yeah.
We seem to be obsessed with writers.
Yeah,
We
struggling writers.
Struggling writers. That's a
Mike
that's a
needs all the
concept.
help he can
Yeah,
get, right?
exactly. So it's called The Forever House, and that is we're very excited about that project and the team that has now
Yeah.
come on board.
Cool.
Yeah.
Nice. I'll just take an opportunity as well. Neil Kleid, I did a book called Nice Jewish Boys. It's available digitally right now via Comixology Originals. I've got postcards with a QR code downstairs. We're working on a print edition. Again, it's a nice, intimate little Jewish crime story that takes place in Teaneck, New Jersey. I've got a book called, as we're talking about fantasy, it's not Judaic, but it's called Kings in Canvas that comes out next month from CEX Publishing. And it's basically Game of Thrones meets Rocky. I've got a couple of copies downstairs for sale. And I'm doing another book for Comixology that's coming out next year I can't talk about. But it's Arthurian baseball story. It's really a lot of fun.
I love it.
Love it.
Yeah.
I want to hear
Yeah,
more.
that I
Yeah.
wanna hear.
Oh, you will. You will. And I'm also available on all social media, except I don't know how much longer I'll be on Twitter. But find me,
Oh, I'm gonna
Blue
miss
Sky,
you
Instagram.
there.
I know.
You're so positive.
I'm very positive. I was positive.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Amit, Ben, and Max. Amit's downstairs at a table. I'm downstairs at a table. Ben and Max are roaming around like morons.
Yeah.
But enjoy the rest of your day.
We're the wandering Jews.
Yes.
Wandering.